respects to their elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people who are present here today. As I mentioned, it's a great honor for me to be able to present to you, and I'm delighted that you've organized this conference to focus on a major problem of tuberculosis. If I could have at the moment, I'm not controlling the slides, so I need somebody to move to the next slide, or else to give me the option of controlling. Oh, now I can control the slides. That's good. Okay. So what can you see here? Can you see my main slide now?
Yes.
You're seeing the main slide. Good. Okay, great. So I wanted to start by pointing out that the burden of tuberculosis is hugely unequally distributed around the world. And in fact, it's hugely, much of the inequality is apparent between Australia, where I am now, and Indonesia, where you are. There are many parts of the world where tuberculosis has essentially been eliminated as a public health problem sometime during the 20th century. But other parts of the world where it is a huge problem. There are about 10 million cases a year around the world and 1.5 million deaths. And many of those happen in Indonesia. So this is a major problem, this inequality in the burden of tuberculosis. But it's important to recognize that this is not an inevitable fact. Many of the current low burden countries, including the one where I sit, were once high burden countries. And they earned and worked to achieve the very low rate of tuberculosis that exists now. This is a plot of deaths due to tuberculosis, in this case in men, but there's a similar plot for women, throughout the 20th century. And you can see here that in the early part of the 20th century, there are many deaths. There was a slow decline in the early part of the 20th century. But then with the advent of chemotherapy and with the advent particularly of a campaign, and I want to use this word particularly, campaign, a national TB campaign that went for about 25 years in Australia, tuberculosis was essentially eliminated. You can see it on this graph. You can see it more clearly on this graph here, that although there was a decline, it steeply declined during the period of the campaign. And similar things happened in many other countries around the world. So most low burden countries were once high burden countries, and many other countries around the world, Japan, Northern Europe, parts of North America, Cuba, in fact, also managed to essentially eliminate tuberculosis with campaigns. And I'm going to talk to you about why we need to now do that in the rest of the world. We need to start by going back to basics about what TB is, because to some extent, my view is that we've lost sight of the fundamental issue about tuberculosis, and that is that it is an infectious disease. And from understanding it as an infectious disease, as we learned very much with COVID, we need to understand that the way to stop TB is ultimately to stop people being infected with TB. With TB, we start out all at birth and in early life without TB infection and without TB disease. Some people develop TB infection, and some of those people who develop TB infection go on to get active pulmonary or lung TB disease. And there is this, you go from being uninfected to being infected, and then some people go on to get infection. But the key part of this is the last arrow, is that these people who have active pulmonary disease are the ones who infect others. If you don't have TB infection, you're at risk of being infected by people who have active pulmonary disease. So we have this triangle or cycle of ongoing transmission of disease, which is what maintains the epidemic in highly endemic situations. We know some of the things that are risk factors for this cycle to continue. We know that the risk of being infected has to do with how close you are in contact, crowding and lack of ventilation, how infectious the case is, and maybe lack of immunity. And we know some of the factors that influence the risk of progressing from TB infection to TB disease. Very young people, very old people, undernutrition, the presence of certain comorbidities, and immunocompromise. All of these increase the risk of progression to active disease. And from this, we know that there are many opportunities to prevent or interrupt this cycle. And it's preventing and interrupting this cycle, which is the fundamental basis for controlling tuberculosis. We know that, and have known for 50 years or more, 70 years, that finding and treating TB is the most important way to interrupt this cycle. Finding and treating people with active pulmonary TB. This was the basis for Stiblow's union model for TB control, that we need to find and treat all of the active cases. We also know, and we've been reminded of this from COVID times, that infection control, social distancing, reduced crowding, better ventilation, all of this reduce the risk of transmission of infection. We would like to have a vaccine, either to prevent you getting infected or to prevent people who are infected from going on to get disease. But at the moment, really, we do not have an effective vaccine. These are wishes, but not yet in reality. And then we know that we need to manage comorbidity better. We need to treat people with HIV with antiretroviral drugs. We need to treat diabetes. We need to treat undernutrition. And managing comorbidity and improving nutrition will reduce the risk of transmission. And finally, we can treat people with latent TB infection. And I think you heard a bit about that in some of the previous sessions about giving treatment to prevent progression to active disease. But all of this slide, what I want to point out to you is that all of this slide is about prevention. We've tended in our discussions about prevention of TB to focus just on this one. By the way, can you see my pointer? I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer, but if you can't, let me just. We've tended to focus on treatment of latent TB infection, but in fact, all of these things are opportunities for prevention of TB. So generally in public health, we talk about primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention in relation to TB is all about stopping people from getting infected in the first place, stopping the disease from getting started, treating risk factors. And that is really the key to TB control, primary prevention, finding, isolating, and treating cases, and improving infection control by measures such as those that are shown here. We can also, though, do secondary prevention, and that is about finding and treating infected individuals and medical management of risk factors, antiretroviral therapy for people with HIV, treatment of diabetes, and better nutrition. These are some of the things that we can do for secondary prevention, but there is no question that primary prevention is by far better than secondary prevention for controlling TB. In high burden settings, such as Indonesia, and the Philippines and Vietnam, places where the prevalence of TB is more than 200 per 100,000. And in some places, it's up to 1,000 per 100,000. There is what's known as endemic transmission of TB. And what endemic transmission means is that there is ongoing, continuing transmission of TB. And ultimately, what that means is that everybody is at risk all the time, everywhere. So in low burden settings, like where I live, that is not the case. There is not endemic transmission, and TB only occurs in outbreaks, in houses, in schools, and so on. But in Indonesia and in other high burden settings, it does occur in outbreaks, but the majority of TB is occurring in endemic transmission, just routine transmission all the time, everywhere. And so in this setting, focusing on outbreaks and on high-risk groups is not helpful. What we need to focus on is controlling the risk everywhere. Most cases, the other important factor to note about highly endemic settings, such as Indonesia, and this has only really become apparent in recent times, is that most cases in endemic situations occur due to recent infection, not due to reactivation of remote past latent infection. So again, in Australia and in North America and in Europe, the majority of cases of TB that do occur in people who were infected many years ago and reactivate latent, remote past latent infection. But that is not what is happening in Indonesia. In Indonesia, most cases are occurring due to recent infection. By recent, I mean within the last 1 to 2 years. So we have done a study, and so what this has important implications for how you control it, because it means that these are the cases that you need to prevent. So we did a study in Vietnam, in the southernmost province of Vietnam, known as Cà Mau. 64 provinces in Vietnam. This is the southernmost, right in the Delta region. Moderately high prevalence and incidence of TB, about 1 million people, a bit more than 1 million people. And we did a cluster randomized control trial. What this means is that we identified what were known as subcommunes. So subcommunes are a unit, an administrative unit of about, with a population of about 1,000 to 1,500 people, 1,000 to 1,500 people. They're like a village. We identified 120 randomly selected clusters and randomized them into intervention and control. And in the intervention group, we screened for TB every year for 4 years. And in the control group, we did not do that. But in the final year, we did screen, and we did the same thing in both groups. So this is what Cà Mau looks like close up. Down here, you can see this is, and you can see here in the dark are the clusters or villages that we did the intervention in. And in the light gray are the ones that were the control. So you can see that they're spread across the whole province. And the intervention consisted, first of all, of mobilizing the community. We went in and spoke with them. Excuse me. We spoke, talked about the intervention, engaged with the community. Then we did a census of the whole population, going house to house, identifying who lived in the village. And then we screened everybody, again, going house to house. And we screened everybody, in this case, simply by collecting a pot of sputum and tested that sputum using the expert test. And this is the diagram we used. It's in Vietnamese, showing how we explained to people how to collect a spontaneous sputum specimen into a jar. They gave it to us and we sent it to the laboratory. And To cut to the chase, this was profoundly effective in reducing the number of people who had TB in the population. Year on year, over 4 years, the prevalence of people in the community fell from 380 per 100,000. So the initial prevalence was 380 per 100,000, down to about, after 4 years, 130 per 100,000. A 72% reduction in the prevalence of TB. We compared it with the control. Compared it with the control group, who we had not screened in the final year, and the prevalence was 44% lower. So we can say that we reduced the prevalence of TB by something between 44 and 72%, a profound and rapid reduction in the prevalence of TB. We also looked at the incidence of TB. Now, for those who are not so familiar with these terms, prevalence and incidence, the prevalence is the number of people who have TB at any given time. The incidence is the number of people who develop TB for the first time. So because we were screening people annually, we were able to say that some people did not have TB when we went to them 1 year, and then the next year they did have TB. So those people developed TB, and that we saw a 57% reduction in the incidence of TB. That's very important because it's people who never needed to be diagnosed, never needed to have symptoms, were never at risk because they never developed TB. And these are the cases that were due to recent transmission. These prevented cases were cases that did not get infected. By finding and treating cases in the community, we prevented those people from being infected. We prevented recent transmission and therefore prevented those cases. We didn't do anything to children in this study. We only tested and treated adults. But what we did do was test for TB infection in children. And what we found was that the prevalence of TB infection in children in the villages where we had done the screening was 50% lower than it was in the villages which we had not done the screening. So this was direct evidence that finding and treating infectious cases of tuberculosis in the population, finding and treating everybody in the population who had TB, prevented transmission, prevented people from being infected with TB. So coming back to this epidemiology of TB in high burden settings, and I mean places like Indonesia, everybody is at risk all the time, everywhere. Outbreaks are not significant, and most cases occur due to recent infection. And the evidence for that is that we saw a 57% decrease in cases of incident cases when we removed the source of infection. The implications of this for TB control in high burden settings, again, like Indonesia, is that we need to find and treat nearly all the people with active TB to prevent infection of others. That is the key to controlling TB. Finding and treating everybody who has infectious TB to switch off ongoing transmission. And in fact, because there is a short window, because most cases are due to recent transmission, recent infection, there is actually a short window of latency and a short window during which people have latent TB infection. And so the opportunity for targeted treatment of latent TB infection or for a post-infection vaccine is not very great. And the key part of getting rid of TB is going to be this and not so much this. So the key components of successfully finding and treating all the cases is to get the community on side. People need to know why we're doing this and they need to be on side. We then need to actually find the cases and we need to effectively treat them. So getting the community on side, creating community demand, we need to make sure people are aware that this is a serious and transmissible infection. People got this message with COVID. They need to get it also with TB. We need to do so in a way that avoids stigma. Stigma has been a major problem with TB. People tend to think it's their fault that they have TB. Nobody should be blamed for having TB, just as nobody should be blamed for having COVID. It is nobody's fault that they have COVID or TB. But they do need to have some sense of responsibility. If you do have TB, you need to accept screening and treatment. And then in return, your community needs to make sure that you get access to free and safe screening and treatment, and possibly payment for your trouble. So this sense of mutual responsibility is important for community engagement. We need to find all the cases, and this is the difficult bit. We need to test everyone. There's been a lot of focus on high-risk groups, low-hanging fruit, people who are trying to just get the high-risk population. The reality is that everybody is at risk. And most cases occur in people who are not in high-risk groups. Okay, that's important. Most cases of TB occur in people who are not in high-risk groups. So we need to test everyone. We need a highly sensitive test, and it needs to be safe, scalable, and accessible. And the things that we have at the moment, which are in that category, are the ultra-portable radiology with artificial intelligence reading. This is the new technology which makes radiology much more accessible and safe and cheaper. So we need that. We need molecular tests on sputum, like Expert or TrueNat. And we are in the pipeline going to get further non-radiological tests, further tests that will meet this need. What we do not need and what will not work is symptoms. Symptoms are not a useful guide to finding cases. Asking people whether they have symptoms is not helpful, because 50% of people who have, at least half of people who have active pulmonary TB and are infecting others do not have symptoms. And not sputum microscopy, not sputum smear, because that only has a sensitivity of about 50% as well. So these are things we need, these are things we don't need. We need to deliver effective treatment linked to the screening program, which needs to confirm the diagnosis, detect drug resistance mutations, prescribe the appropriate treatment, dispense good drugs in a timely manner, manage adverse events, and support people to adhere to treatment. All of those things are key to making sure that patients actually, there's no point in diagnosing cases, finding cases, if you don't get them to have effective treatment. So in conclusion, we can end TB. We can end TB in Indonesia and in other high burden settings, but we need to do some particular things. We need a campaign. I mentioned the word campaign at the beginning. We need a campaign to find all people with infectious TB, and that means we need to test everyone. It needs to be sustained for a few years. We don't exactly know how long, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. And what we can expect if we implement this campaign is a very rapid decline in the number of cases found. As soon as you start the campaign, you will get a rapid fall off in the number of cases each year that you find. And eventually you will find virtually no cases and you can end the campaign. The return on investment for implementing this campaign is the end of TB as a public health problem. I just want to finally acknowledge my two key collaborators in all of this work, Nguyen Tuang and Greg Fox, who've been instrumental in all of this, and another large group of collaborators in Vietnam and in Australia who've been very important to me in doing much of this work. And finally, I want to advertise the Union Conference. I don't know whether I've got 5 minutes.
The organizing committee maybe help with the sound of the video.
That's it. So I hope to be able to see you online at the union conference in November. And here's how you register if you wish to. So thank you very much for allowing me to present to you today. And as I say, it's been a great honor to present to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Gemarks. Please give a round of applause. It's a very comprehensive presentation, and we learned a lot from the community trial that the regular test or annual test can reduce both the prevalence and also the incidence of the TB cases. And the key message is that it's quite similar from what our Minister of Health yesterday said to us, that we need to find all cases in order to switch off the ongoing transmission. And from the study you have presented, that nearly or about 60% are new infections, and that's the key point, I think. And yeah, we have a lot of challenges in the test, of course, and also I think the big homework is the community engagement, like you said, so creating a community demand. So now we will invite a comment or question from the participants from the floor. Please, if you have any question, please raise your hand. Maybe one or two questions. No? If not, maybe I can ask your opinions, Professor Gemarks, about your experience in running the study in Vietnam. How do you see the community engagement there, and what sort of tips that you can share with us to create the community demand? Because I think this, yeah.
Well,
Please.
actually, it's a very good question. And in fact, in a place like Vietnam, and I suspect it would be similar in rural areas, particularly in Indonesia, and maybe also in urban areas in Indonesia, there is a lot of there's a lot of demand, and there's a lot of we found that people were very grateful that somebody was coming and bringing healthcare to them. So you need to make it easy. You need to make it accessible. You need to make it safe. But the idea that we were going to their houses or to their villages, which rarely saw healthcare provision, and testing them for a serious disease, was that they were very happy about. I think one of the issues that we need to overcome is misunderstandings about TB and stigma about TB. And as I said during the talk, we need this balance between, on the one hand, people recognizing, yes, it's a serious disease, and if you have the disease, you have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to your community, to accept treatment. Okay, because if you don't accept treatment, it's not only you who is harmed by it, it's your family and your community that is harmed by it. So we need to try and balance that with the other side of it, as I said, that's not attaching blame to people for having TB. It's not your fault that you have TB, but when you have TB, you need to do something about it. And I think that's the balance that we need to put in place. But we did not find resistance in rural Vietnam, and it was very well accepted. And it has to do with, how you deliver healthcare. You treat people with respect, and which is what we did. You need to make sure that you're treating your community with the respect that they are owed.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gemarks. Due to time constraints, I think we can conclude the session here. The key component in active case finding for TB is the creating community demand, finding all cases and deliver the right treatment safely and effectively. So that's the key messages from the Professor Gemarks from today's keynote speech. Please give a round of applause to the Professor Gemarks, and thank you very much for giving a keynote speech. So we are happy we have a key person for the keynote speech today. Thank you very much.
That's very generous. Thank you very much.
So, good morning. Dengan demikian saya akhiri sesi keynote speech hari ini. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Saya akhiri dengan para Santi Om, Santi, Santi, Santi Om.